Rumi Poetry and our Ecological Predicament. Well, you're listening to a practical poetry podcast with Dale Byron. That's me. Nothing rarefied or pretentious here. Only hardworking poems. Poems as tools for living more full and satisfying lives. Poems to help us remember what's most important in our lives, to understand what's happening, to grow and rebalance ourselves, and of course, poems to inspire and to help us experience more gratitude. And finally, poems to help us with loss, grief, and the healing we all need in this life. Well, in this episode, featuring the amazing poet Rumi, we will explore the ecological predicament we're in and how poetry can play a vital role in helping us in these times. So here's some sobering context for us. We've talked about this before on the podcast. You know, we're facing more ecological challenges than you can shake a proverbial stick at, from rampant extinctions to rainforest destruction to melting ice caps, to soil erosion, to plastic in the oceans, soon to be weighing as much as all the fish and sea life combined. That's in about 10 years as far as estimates go. To mass human migrations due to droughts and crop failures, which are already happening and were happening even before the war broke out in Ukraine, to ever-increasing wildfires, in particular here on the West Coast where I'm speaking this evening. That is a big part of our reality. And yes, to climate change and a set of tipping points that we cannot really predict, but know are unfolding on some level before our eyes. We are playing a kind of Russian roulette with these tipping points at this point. All these kinds of facts are, of course, incredibly upsetting and fear-inducing. And if we only focus on these admittedly dreadful facts, we become sitting ducks for feeling a sense of overwhelm at minimum and outright despair on the other hand. We could oscillate between those two if, again, we only focused on the facts, the linear facts that are before us. So here is where I believe, and I've talked about this before on this podcast, but here is where I believe the right kind of poetry can help us. You see, while listening to the more true and accurate stories and facts, while that's critical, it's absolutely critical. We can't ignore it. We can't deny it. And while those stories and facts are critical, it is also critical to engage our hearts at the same time. You see, engaging our hearts tends to help us be, more resilient, able to handle difficulty in a whole different way. To put it, I guess, simply, if we have a strong emotional base and what we might say a strong emotional why in life, W-H-Y in life, we will be able to handle a much more difficult what and when as far as our needed actions. And I wrote a little something about this in the last week or two. I said, to hear the earth's most difficult truth. So to hear the earth's most difficult truths requires a mind that is receptive and open. Yet to bear the full weight of those truths takes a strongest heart even as it is broken. You see, I guess what I was trying to get at there is that the facts, particularly the facts around ecological overshoot and all the many symptoms of that. And of course, climate change is only one of a half dozen symptoms that we are facing of the core problem of overshoot. But when it comes to that, there's no way, I think, if we allow our hearts to be open, which of course is one of the things that poetry does, it not only makes us resilient, but it makes us resilient in a paradoxical way because we allow our hearts to be broken. We allow our hearts to be broken. Which brings me to the first poem of our featured poet, which of course is the poet Rumi, and this is one of his very short little poems, and the translation in this case was done by Coleman Barks. We'll call on Coleman Barks for a number of translations in this particular episode, but it goes like this. Come, come, whoever you are, come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving. It doesn't matter. It does not matter. Ours is not a caravan of despair. Come, come, even if you have broken your vows 100 times. Come, come again, come. I love it. I love this part. Ours is not a caravan of despair. Come, come, even if you have broken your vows 100 times. Come, come again, come. So, as I mentioned, that's our featured poet, and that is the world-renowned poet known, as I have already said, simply as Rumi. And, you know, what's interesting, a little fun fact, is that Rumi, it may still be true, but in the early years of the 2000s, Rumi was indicated to be the best-selling poet in the United States. I just think it's wild because here's this poet who wrote mostly in Persian, and Rumi was born on the eastern shores of the then Persian Empire in 1207. So here's this Persian poet who is the best-selling poet in the United States, and it may still be true. And he was born in what is now Afghanistan, and he eventually settled. It was a kind of a wild time with lots of stuff going on politically and otherwise, but he ended up settling in a town, I believe it's pronounced Konya, and in what is now Turkey. But even though the Persian Empire predated back in these days, in the 1200s, it predated these other countries, he is still claimed, he's so famous and so revered that he is claimed as the national poet for Iran, Turkey, and Afghanistan. So, how do we use this short poem that I just read? How do we use this short poem in the way that we're talking about to help us, particularly to help us in any kind of difficult situation, but to help us in particular, we're talking about this ecological predicament that we're in. And, you know, I guess I should say that I use the word predicament very decidedly because it is so complex. What we're dealing with in terms of our ecological overshoot is so complex. It deals with so many different things, as we've already talked about, so many different places it's showing up, that we must call it a predicament, because simply calling it a challenge really kind of wears out the word challenge. It's more like a conundrum or a predicament because it's so incredibly complex. But a way to dust off after yet another setback, one of the things that occurred to me is that you could read this poem after a setback and say, or a disappointment, or something where progress, and in this case, oftentimes progress seems slow or nearly impossible. Or maybe you would use this poem when you were beginning to beat yourself up for not being heroic enough, like somehow or another, I should be doing more, I should be having more effect in the world and all of that. And I'm not saying that that's not a question to ask ourselves, but, we need average people doing average things, not heroes. Sorry is the land that needs heroes. In fact, I think I mentioned this on a previous podcast that a friend of mine said, I want to be a single drop in a raging storm. A single drop in a raging storm. I think that really puts it in perspective for us. And it says you don't have to be a hero. You just have to be a human being working on it, caring about it. Or another case to use this poem, where I love those last lines that says, come if you have broken your vows, come even if you have broken your vows 100 times. Now, you know how, especially with this subject of climate and overshoot, extinction, plastic in the ocean, pollution, all these different things that we know so well and unfortunately know so well, we sometimes have a tendency, if we're not beating up on ourselves, we're beating up on somebody else. We're kind of imagining that they're doing whatever they're doing as a personal affront, that they somehow are a terrible person. And I'm not saying there's not some terrible people who are doing stuff out there, egregious stuff around this climate question and around this overshoot question, but this poem reminds us to not only have empathy for ourselves, but for others, and that we all break our vows over and over again. And so I guess we might even be able to summon a drop or two of compassion for the oil company executive that is operating inside a system and a context that is, quite frankly, deeply insane. Deeply insane. A context that says externalities, pollution, things that are happening outside of what is actually being counted, and the accountants call that externalities, which is completely insane. But if you grew up in that system, if that's all that you knew was that you could externalize the cost of pollution, of climate, of, in the case of fracking, that you could externalize the cost of destroying deep aquifers and destroying people's water. If you can call that an externality and you've grown up in that system where profit is the only thing that matters, well, you have really been... again, I'm not talking about people not taking personal responsibility, and I'm not talking about not making people accountable. I'm just saying that systemically, we have got to make it so we are not indoctrinating each other with these insane assumptions and these insane systems. And if we do that, this little poem might remind us to have a little more equanimity for ourselves and for others. So let's move on to another wonderful Rumi poem, or as sometimes people say, I think it's wonderful, you'll be the judge. But anyway, the poem is called The Way Wings Should. The Way Wings Should. It goes like this. What will our children do in the morning? What will our children do in the morning? Will they wake with their hearts wanting to play? the way wings should? Will they have dreamed the needed flights and gathered the strength from the planets that all men and women need to balance the wonderful charms of the earth, so that her power and beauty does not make us forget our own? I know all about the ways of the heart. I know all about the ways of the heart, how it wants to be alive. Love so needs to love that it will endure almost anything, even abuse, just to flicker for a moment. But the sky's mouth is kind. Its song will never hurt you, for I sing these words. What will our children do in the morning if they do not see us fly? What will our children do in the morning if they do not see us fly? That poem is in a collection of poems called Love Poems from God, 12 Sacred Voices from the East and West by Daniel Ladinsky, who was the one who did that translation. And upon reading that poem and meditating on that poem, again, we're focused this episode on Rumi. It occurs to me, how will the children do in this world we are leaving? That's, in some ways, a scary question. And what if we considered that all children are our children? What are they seeing the adults doing? Are they seeing the adults fly? Teaching them how to do that, as the Rumi poem suggests? How can they reconcile as these children get older? And I don't mean that much older, but I mean old enough to be able to grok what's happening. And you see how many kids are in some ways traumatized, in many ways traumatized by what's happening ecologically, just as adults are being traumatized. And how can they reconcile the dire warnings with the reality that we seem to be doing everything possible to not change, to not reduce our use of fossil fuels, not reduce the use of finite minerals and materials? And I don't mean this is some simple question. I know this is incredibly complex. And yet I see the conundrum, the difficulty that so many face, and I see the idea, or that we face, where we believe that if we tell the truth, it's almost like we're going to bum each other out so much that we're going to just throw ourselves and others into such a state of despair that we will not be able to even move. And yet, this is exactly what we're talking about here. The use of these artful poems, these poems by the great poets like Rumi, that allow us to open our hearts, to even let, as we've already said, to let our hearts break wide open so that we are able to face the truth, to take real action in the world. This, I think, is what the children need to see. We are told that technology will save us. We are told that we can continue to grow at current rates until forever. So, for example, here's one of those sobering facts. If we continue to grow our Western economies like the United States at roughly 3% per year, which is roughly what we've grown over the last 50 years on balance, we will double, if we do that, 3% a year, we will double the use of energy, of minerals, and other materials in the next 30 years. Double what we have used in the last 10,000 years. Please think about that. I know it seems beyond credibility. However, that is simply the math of exponential growth, that we will double our use of energy and materials and minerals, all of it, if we continue to grow at 3%. 3%, 30 years. And we will double again in the next 30 years. So if a child is 5 years old, will easily live for this second doubling. But here is the fact. Here is a sobering fact. And we may need 2 poems for this. And that is that the math is impossible. That math is impossible. That 2 doublings over the next 60 years absolutely is at war with physics and is at war with reality itself. It cannot happen. And yet, our current economic system uses that as an assumption that is true. So, after that, let's have a little fast round of Rumi. These are all Coleman Barks. These are quotes and pieces of poems, but let's just do like a fast round. He said it like this. He said, "Today, like every other day, we wake up empty and frightened. Don't open the door to the study and begin reading. Take down the dulcimer. Let the beauty we love be what we do. There are hundreds of ways to kneel and kiss the ground." How's that for a poem to bring you back into your heart, to help you rebalance, and so that you can allow your heart to be open and broken if needed, and I think it is needed, so that we are not left in despair, but so that we are able to move and do the best that we can. Today, like every other day, said Rumi, we wake up empty and frightened. Don't open the door to the study and begin reading. Take down the dulcimer. Let the beauty we love be what we do. There are hundreds of ways to kneel and kiss the ground. You see, my experience of writing over 30-ish years is that when I begin to write, I often will come up with ideas and things occur to me that I am quite certain would never have occurred to me if I didn't start out, if I didn't begin to write. So one of the reasons that it is so important to use, I think, this kind of poetry to open our hearts is because once our hearts are open, even with all the difficulties of the facts that we are facing, of the context that we are facing, even with all of that, with our heart open and our values beginning to shift and change, who knows what we're capable of? Who knows? So here's another short little line from Rumi. If you are irritated by every rub, how will you be polished? If you're irritated by every rub, how will you be polished? Well, there's a wonderful little thing to read, when you've had another little setback or something difficult's happened. Hey, You're just being polished. That wasn't a difficulty that was, that was personal for you. Here's another. Do not be satisfied with the stories that come before you. Unfold your own myth. Unfold your own myth. See, I think this is so important because I'm not saying that we ought to be, trashing the economics, the economists. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that they have been brought up and educated in a system, and they've got a lot of vested interest in continuing the system that, in my mind and in many other people's minds, is starting to look more and more insane. And it's not the fact of personally attacking them. It's more the fact of we've got to create a different story. We've got to unfold a different myth. We cannot continue with the myth that we can have infinite growth on a finite planet. The basics of physics and reality say that cannot work. Here's another. Sell your cleverness and buy bewilderment. Oh, I use that one all the time. Because, see, we can be so clever, but sometimes we just need to be bewildered. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. That's a great line by the poet Wendell Berry. We featured him last time. Okay, another Rumi line. Respond to every call that excites your spirit. See, what will we be able to do with spirits that are called out, that are excited? And then one final one in this fast round of Rumi. Why do you stay in prison when the door is so wide open? Now, I just imagine these quotes as kind of just-in-time soul savers, soul and maybe sanity savers, where you receive, one or more of what I call the 3 magic gifts from poetry. And there's many gifts, but these are 3 magic gifts that I think have to do with wisdom, because I think if we're going to be wiser, then we have to look to poetry for 3 important things. For context, which means to help us see the whole system as opposed to reducing it down to pieces and parts. Context and systems. Poetry gives us, master classes in that all the time. The second is humility. Poems help us be humble. And I think that if anything is called for in this ecological crisis that we are dealing with, this ecological conundrum, paradox, this predicament we're in, it's being more humble and realizing where we are vulnerable, And finally, is the idea, and we talked about this last episode, of that paradox. Being able to live with paradox is so important. One of my mentors, I mentioned this as well, Brother David Stindlerath, said, not every paradox is a great truth, but in order to be a great truth, it must be a paradox. Okay, well, we're headed for the barn, so let's finish with one more delicious Rumi poem. That's, of course, the poet that we're featuring on this episode. This episode called Rumi Poetry and Our Ecological Predicament. And the poem is called Say Yes Quickly. Say Yes Quickly. And this is, let's just do the poem. Okay. Forget your life. Forget your life. Say God is great. Get up. Forget your life. Say God is great. Get up. You think you know what time it is? It's time to pray. You've carved so many little figurines, too many. Don't knock on any random door like a beggar. Reach your long hands out to another door beyond where you go on the street where everyone says, "How are you?" and no one says, "How aren't you?" Tomorrow you'll see what you've broken and torn tonight, thrashing in the dark. Inside you, there's an artist you don't know about, and he's not interested in how things look different in moonlight. If you are here unfaithfully with us, you're causing terrible damage. If you've opened your loving to God's love, if you've opened your loving to God's love, then you're helping people you don't know and have never seen. Is what I say true? Say yes quickly. Say yes quickly. If you've known it from before the beginning of the universe. Is what I say true? Say yes quickly. If you've known it from before the beginning of the universe. I think that poem is a heart opener. I think that poem can fly under the radar screen of the logical, linear mind, and sometimes that's exactly what we need so that we do not fall victim to despair and depression and become immobilized in that. So you see how when you're burdened, weighed down, bummed with one too many depressing facts, as I was just saying, and the figures are just pounding you about where we are ecologically, you can try this poem. You can let your heart be grateful, not for what is happening. Sometimes we can't be grateful for what's happening this moment, but we can always be grateful for the opportunity, the possibility to grow stronger even in the face of this difficulty, and we have the possibility of making change. So, finally, a few last comments. What happens to us if we do fall into a kind of state of despair, just feeling bereft of all hope? Well, Rumi's got something to say about that as well. And I'm going to share it with you because this might be your secret weapon. This might be the thing that you need to put in your poetry first aid kit. And just have it there when you read a new article about our ecological predicament, so you can pull it out in a moment's notice if you need it. It will help you, I think. Rumi said it like this. He said, "There is a secret medicine given only to those who hurt so hard they can't hope. The hopers would feel slighted if they knew." One more time. There is a secret medicine given only to those who hurt so hard, they can't hope. They can't hope. The hopers would feel slighted if they knew. Isn't that such a table-turning paradox stepping into, how would I describe it? Just a wonderful way to pull the rug right out from under ourselves just when we need it. Just when we need it. And, we can say, of course, poetry has been said that poetry is the art of hearing ourselves say things that we did not know we knew. And I think this is a wonderful example of that we could use again in our first aid kit for just such times. So I would close with saying that for Rumi, religion was mostly a personal experience and not limited to logical arguments or perceptions of the senses. This is why I think he's such a wonderful poet for the purposes that we're talking about, to balance out the heady stuff, the difficult stuff, the facts, and the figures when it comes especially to these ecological, to what we're dealing with ecologically. And, he was into creative love, or the urge to rejoin the spirit to divinity was the goal toward which everything moves, Rumi thought. The dignity of life, in particular human life, which is conscious of its divine origin and goal. That was important to Rumi. And I would just say, when it comes to this whole thing about the ecological, understatement to say concerns, but these whole ecological matters that we've been talking about, it's become somewhat fashionable to say that, human beings are totally flawed, and that we, there's just no way because we are so flawed and it's so terrible. Well, I'm not so sure about that. I'm not so sure I believe that. I think we are incredibly social critters. We are social critters, and I think in a particular cultural context, we can act really unskillful. There's no doubt about that. And yet, I think that when we are cooperating and supporting each other in the values of cooperation and the values of supporting and not, tearing down the natural world, not extracting from the natural world, when we're in a culture where we're reinforcing each other for loving, and almost like the animist religion, where we make our religion the love of the natural world, that in that context, we as human beings can be incredibly, incredibly skillful. And I'm holding out for that. That's part of the vision that I'm holding out for. And at the same time, there's a thought that says, we might as well tell the truth. We are already living it anyway. We might as well tell the truth. We're already living it anyway. And my belief is that these poems will allow us to tell the truth, will allow us to step into difficulty without losing what I think of as our humanity, without losing the parts of ourselves that are called out in these social settings, in these cultural settings, where we are good stewards, and treat the natural world as it is sacred, and as though we are embedded, not separate from, but embedded and part of the natural world. Okay, well, that's a wrap. I really, really appreciate your listening ear. If you have learned something, if you felt a little sense of inspiration, please pass this podcast along to others. I would love that. And if you want to make a comment wherever you listen to the podcast, whether it's on one of the traditional sites or on YouTube, I post these on YouTube as well, then, make a comment or, whatever. Just pass it along if this seems worthwhile to you. And in the meantime, you take good care of yourself.